very much for coming. Hadani is going to do a reading and show some video footage, and afterwards she will take questions, and her books are available here for sale, and she is happy to sign them afterwards. I'm not going to introduce Hadani because there's somebody who is much more proficient in that than I am, and that is Michael Higgins, who has spearheaded the campaign against the preemptive strike on Iraq in 2003. He spearheaded that campaign in Ireland. And he's also an honorary professor at the Centre for Human Rights here in NUI Galway. So I'm going to ask Michael to introduce Hadani Ditmars. And I would ask you, before he does that, please take a second to turn off your mobile phones. Thank you. Thank you.
It's a very great pleasure to introduce this reading and presentation by Hadani Ditmars. We're very fortunate to have somebody who has such roots in the region and also who has such experience in what those who do not want to get engaged with consequences call conflict zones, and for those who are morally moved regard as sometimes great and atrocious consequences of war. I am very much moved also by the presentation that is here in the Maxima, both downstairs and upstairs, which shows the ingress of war and destruction on the lives of people. The significant contribution that this book makes is that it is powerfully human, if you like. Hadani has in fact, been to Beirut, and you will see upstairs photographs of the destruction of Beirut, and she has been in Israel, Palestine and Iraq. And this particular book is one that is based on her visit in the period in 6 visits really, 1997, which ended in 1997 and then in 2003. So it's an attempt, if you like, as well, which is very interesting, to re-engage with the texture of Iraqi society, meet the people that she had met before, and see how the war had impacted on their lives. If you like, encounter their extraordinary resilience. Her work has been published in the New York Times, The Independent, the Globe and Mail, Time, Vanity Fair, Newsweek, and she's contributed regularly to BBC and NBC. I just feel that when I had this book in my hand, I looked at it with some trepidation, because it's very difficult for me to read about Iraq, I have to say, because I'm very conscious of the near silent, dehumanized way in which the public now looks at ever more bodies, ever more deaths on Iraq. It is in the same way as people became numbed in terms of their response to the after the Somalian famine. But what the book does is that it engages with the people of Iraq themselves. And I think what is very important about Hadani and her Lebanese origins, I would suggest, is that she's in a position to engage with the cultural background that is the basis of the resilience of the Iraqi people and their long memory. Iraq didn't come into existence with Saddam Hussein, nor was it experiencing democracy for the first time after invasion. When I first went to Iraq in 1990-91, I was very struck by the inscription of the Code of Hammurabi outside the Parliament building, the first written code of law in the world. I was also later, when I had been lecturing here in this university over years, of the contribution of Ur and Sumer, and of the enormous contribution to astronomy and architecture, the saving by people in Iraq of the Greek culture and their transmission through Spain. But what I think Hadani has put herself into, with considerable risk, as you read the book, as you will see, as it was never easy, both in terms of the first experience and in the recovery of the experience, which is even more difficult, is, if you like, an encounter with the Iraqi people in a deep sense, I do think that Richard Down's very book was his book on Iraq was enormously valuable because of his knowledge of the Sufi tradition and Iraqi culture. This shines through this book. I think as well, what you'll also see is the Philistinism of occupation. And it, for like as people with no experience or opportunity of knowing or encountering what the culture of that place which they have found themselves and what it does to people, and if you like how they deliver it with incredible consequences. I've very little much to say except to say those of us who visited then after that, I went to Iraq before Saddam was toppled and before the Gulf War. It was a time when it had the highest number of women professionals in the professions. It was a secular space between threatening fundamentalisms of one kind or another. Then I went back, the sanctions were there, and it was then I met Margaret Hassan, whose body has never been found, and who was preparing for both describing the consequences of the sanctions and preparing for what would be a food program for children. And then just immediately 3 or 4 weeks before the most recent war, I visited Iraq again, and I was quite convinced that the diplomatic strategies had not been exhausted and that we should try to do everything possible to avoid the horror of war. I finish by saying that I do agree with Hadani, and you brought us up to ourselves, as you will see when the final footage of the orchestra and whatever, is that resilience isn't casual. The Iraqi people said the British were here before. They're very well aware of how, if you like, occupation took place, how lines were drawn in sand, and royal families were invented, and kings came and went. And indeed in the book there is an interview with the king. I think, the would-be king. I think that maybe what's harrowing in it too is the visit to Amaria, the bomb shelter where human flesh is on the walls to this day, has become a shrine to the consequences of war. I think that the other side, which is very beautiful in a way, is how underneath it all people go on stressing that it is the most important human gesture to simply say I go on, but that leading that struggle to go on are the cultural artists, and behind the cultural artists those from such long traditions as the Sufi tradition, of course where Baghdad was the source of the 3 major schools of that. So for all these reasons you can see how important a book it is and how fortunate we are that Hadani Ditmars is here to speak for book herself and to, if you like, bring us through then a short presentation. So I'm looking forward to this, I'm sure, as much as you are. Thank you.
Well, that was really the most wonderful introduction I've had to date. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here at the Galway Arts Festival. I'm really thrilled to be reading in Ireland again, a country like Iraq that has such a rich vein of culture and an ancient heritage. I remember getting a call from Paul Fahy a few months ago inviting me here, and actually I was in Israel-Palestine at the time researching my next book. I happened to be on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem on a lawn chair at the Hebrew University, contemplating my next trip to Ramallah when I got this call from Galway. So it's quite appropriate to be here among all these photos, some of which are actually of Ramallah. This connection between Ireland and the Middle East has been unfolding in my life for the last year and a half. I blame it all on Conall Morrison, the director and playwright who staged Euripides' The Back High, set in Baghdad last April. He found my book, Dancing in the No-Fly Zone, on Christmas Eve in a bookstore in Glasgow. It wasn't even supposed to be on the shelves. It was somehow miraculously there. He found it. He read it and he wrote to my publisher asking permission to excerpt some of it for the program notes. And when my publisher told me the news, I felt compelled to come to Ireland, a place I'd never managed to visit previously, and see the play. And when I arrived here, I somehow felt instantly right at home. So a year and a half later, this is now my 4th trip to Ireland. And it was actually on a brief visit to Galway last year that my intuitive sense of resonance between Ireland and the Middle East was confirmed by a chance encounter with a book, actually with local author Bob Quinn's The Atlantean Irish. It's a book that makes a rather compelling argument for the influence of Moroccan maritime traders in the Middle Ages on Irish culture, language, music, and mythology. So since we're in Galway, I thought I would just read a tiny bit of this. Is Bob here tonight by any chance? No. I'd like to meet him. I just turned to this morning and I thought it was worthwhile reading. When a Lebanese visitor to the Royal Irish Academy in the 1850s was asked to read from an ancient copy of the Quran owned by the Academy, he proceeded to chant it in the style of a muezzin, the person who does the call to prayer in Islam. Coming up the stairs at the same time was Eugene O'Curry, a well-known antiquarian and native Irish speaker. As soon as the visitor stopped, O'Curry took up the refrain, but he continued in the strain of a keener or sean-nós singer of the west of Ireland. The people present said they could not distinguish between the two forms of chant or the words used. They concluded that the two musical forms were related. So there's lots of interesting connections that Bob makes in that book that might explain my sense of connection to Ireland. But in any case, the book seems to be doing well here. It seems to have really struck a chord with the Irish people. But I guess, you know, a thing or two about occupation, sectarian conflict, and cultural resistance. But beyond these connections, one of the things that really struck me was the love of poetry, storytelling, the oral tradition in general, in both cultures. When I watched the nanoseconds of televisual horror that the cradle of civilization has been reduced to, the nightly news ritual of the latest bombings in Iraq, I see a foreign land. This is not the Iraq I remember. I remember an Iraq where poetry, not sectarian strife, was the national obsession. A Canadian poet friend of mine recounted the story of when he was invited to read in Baghdad at the height of the Iran-Iraq War in the late 80s. He went out for a stroll one evening, something one used to be able to do quite safely in Baghdad, and he found the streets deserted. He returned to his hotel to ask if anything was the matter, and no, smiled the night deskman. Everyone, he said, is at home watching the national poetry competition on television. The Iraq that I remember was a place where, even at the height of twin terrors of Saddam and sanctions, there was a thriving theater scene, an Iraqi orchestra that played on, even with cracked oboe reeds and frayed violin strings, and hundreds of art galleries. Iraq was a place where maqam, the quintessentially Iraqi form of sung love poetry, was sung at every wedding and party. Now, thanks to the terrible combination of criminal anarchy, fundamentalist thuggery, and a de facto ban on live music, there is no more maqam in Baghdad. This is almost inconceivable. It's like no more sean-nós in Galway. Iraqis used to have such a sharp sense of dark humor as well. I was reminded of this while watching The Revenant the other night, based on McCabe's The Butcher Boy, with its reference to an exploding coffin. It's quite dark humor. It reminded me of a joke circulating in sanctions-plagued Baghdad in the late 90s. No matter how difficult things were, Iraqis would make light of their situation. The joke went like this: I have a carpenter friend with a big sale on this week. Yeah, what kind of things does he make? Well, he specializes in coffins. So, what's the sale? Half price for newlyweds. But on my last trip to post-invasion Iraq, there weren't even any jokes circulating. rebuilding the physical infrastructure of a place that's been bombed and embargoed and tyrannized for decades is no small task. But how do you rebuild a culture and society that's been smashed to smithereens? I'd like to show you a little video clip now before I read some excerpts from the book. This is actually a combination of an interview that was done with me at the Harbourfront Literary Festival in Toronto, wonderful festival, and the lovely people at Book Television in Canada actually edited some of my post-invasion footage. I work from video when I'm in war zones, and I came in with a very small camera, which that gentleman, Massimo, is filming me with. Thank you, grazie Massimo. Small enough that I could hide under my abaya and that no one would mistake for a rocket launcher and kill me because of that, or rob me. So I was able to actually get interviews with women in the mosque after Friday prayers and go to people's homes and marketplaces and mosques and churches and the National Theatre. And there was a kind of intimacy with the video because it was so small and I could just have conversations with people. So I really feel privileged because I was able to go back from August until October 2003, post-invasion. As Mr. Higgins said, I've been going extensively as a reporter from 1997 on. But that time, post-invasion, August to October 2003, was really like a window of opportunity where it was still safe enough, just, not really with hindsight, but we thought it was, so we did it, to actually go out and be with Iraqi people in their actual environments rather than reporting from hotel rooms, which is what a lot of people were reduced to, and using Iraqi stringers soon after that. So you're just going to see a little flash of the 35 hours of video that I have. The first image is actually of the Sufi tariqa in Baghdad, which you can read about in my book. Mr. Higgins mentioned the Sufi tradition, which really, I mean, Iraq is like the birthplace of Sufism, especially Baghdad. So there's also scenes from the book market, which was a place that every Friday would just be an incredible scene under sanctions. You would see people tearfully selling off their collections of Walt Whitman and all kinds of poetry in Arabic, English, French, Spanish, to pay for basics like food and medicine. That book market doesn't really exist anymore, nor does the Poets Cafe down the street, which was blown up, I think, about 6 months ago. You're going to see some images that you really can't see anymore. Anyway, I'll just let it speak for itself. If the lovely and talented Tom, my technical angel, would like to roll. Thank you.
Coming up, Canadian journalist Hadani Ditmars goes deep inside Iraq.
The fruits of the American invasion resulted in this kind of theocracy.
The Americans being here in the old palace?
When I entered this palace for the first time in my life, when the American came,
yeah.
I mean, we're not supposed to enter any place in here.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's so kind of sarcastic. When the American came,
yeah.
I got in.
Every time I went to Iraq, I would be able to gauge how things were going politically, socially, economically by checking in with these friends of mine. The cellist in the Baghdad Philharmonic, Kareem, who's in the book. Ahlam, the single mother hairdresser with the 2 kids who was raising them in sanctions-plagued Baghdad.
When we came as liberators, we have experience being liberators.
Being a woman in Iraq, I mean, I'm just a journalist, you know, first and foremost, but because of the gender differences in Iraqi society, there was certainly a difference in perception.
Poets Cafe.
because I have some Middle Eastern ancestry and I was able to pass physically often as an Iraqi, that worked to my disadvantage, actually. I was really like the girl next door or someone's wife or girlfriend or sister, so I didn't get that much respect from the men that ran the Ministry of Information. I had to really earn it. Of course, being a woman was an advantage in terms of being able to speak with women and photograph women and film women and hear their stories. I met three sisters. They opened up and they talked to me and they let me film them, and I interviewed their mother, who was only 55 or something, but looked ancient and really had been through a lot. And I asked her, I said, are things better now for Iraqi women? And she said, no, they've gotten worse. And she was married at age 8 and had, something like 18 children, and only half of them survived. But she said, no, but things were better in my day, because look at my daughters, look what they've been through. One of them has this husband who went mad after the war and is leaving her and all that, So she really spoke to how, essentially 2 decades of war and sanctions have impacted on Iraqi men and women, but of course with a very negative impact on women's status. And we are talking about a country that, where up until the 80s, 40% of doctors were women, half the civil service were women. Women had a role in public life. They had very liberal family law and divorce law, unlike now with the Sharia law enshrined in the new constitution. I knew things were really getting bad when I heard from a young musician friend recently that live music has been more or less banned in Baghdad because basically the fruits of the American invasion have resulted in this kind of theocracy. But to hear that there was no more music being played in the cradle of civilization really struck me, because there had been such a lively, vital culture. We were led on this PR tour of Abu Ghraib prison in 2003 in September by Janice Karpinski, who was later dismissed as the head of prisons in Iraq. And this was 8 months before the scandal broke, but it was rife with irony at the time, but you can imagine in hindsight, reading this chapter about this PR tour. At the time, the Americans were trying to mine it for PR gold, saying, we're kinder, gentler, more humane jailers, and look at our new dental facility. But of course, they wouldn't let us speak to any prisoners, and they took us on this Kafka meets Disneyland tour of the old death chamber, and lowered the hanging platform and talked about what happened to people and how they were tortured and executed.
In the cases where the hanging was not complete, unfortunately, below, they were cut from the rope and then they were taken into the gas chamber.
Meanwhile, the creepy Baathist doctor who used to issue death certificates under the old regime had been rehired by the Americans. So you kind of wondered, how much had really changed.
Lovely. Disco music at the end is always really incongruous after the Abu Ghraib footage, but such is the world. So that footage you saw was of this weird PR tour of Abu Ghraib prison, which forms a whole chapter in my book. And again, the book market, and there was a couple of other images that you might not have caught unless you were in Baghdad recently, but there was a statue in one of the shots. Actually, the statue was of Sadoun, who was the father of Iraqi democracy. So I'm going to read 2 more excerpts and then show you some video footage. This next one, I'm focusing a lot on the cultural aspects of the book. We all know about Abu Ghraib, but you can read that chapter, it's pretty chilling. Since we are at an arts festival, and since the culture of Iraq is so much what I'm really hoping to pay tribute to in this book. So theater had this boom under the embargo because there were all kinds of things on a dual-use list, which meant that they could conceivably have a military purpose, and they included chlorine for water purification, lead pencils, stethoscopes,